Some doors should never be opened, some basements should stay sealed, and some things should never be seen. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare for nightmares. Let's begin. The radio that plays the dead Emily had always been drawn to antiques. The scent of aged wood and the mystery behind each item's history fascinated her. So, when she stumbled upon a dusty old radio at an estate sale, she couldn't resist. The radio had a wooden casing, intricately carved with swirling patterns, and large brass dials that gleamed under the dim lighting. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. The elderly woman selling it eyed Emily with a peculiar expression. "That radio," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "is not like the others." Emily raised an eyebrow. "How so?" The woman hesitated, then leaned in closer. "It plays voices, but not from the living." A chill ran down Emily's spine, but she brushed it off. The woman was probably just trying to spook her into not buying it. But Emily was stubborn, and a part of her was intrigued by the tale. She handed over the cash and took the radio home. That night, she placed it on her bedside table, admiring its craftsmanship. It smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. Out of curiosity, she turned the knob. Static crackled through the speakers, but beneath it, she swore she heard faint murmurs. Probably just interference from another frequency, she reasoned. As the days passed, the murmurs became clearer. It started with indistinct whispers, words she couldn't quite make out. Then, one night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the whispers transformed into voices. "Emily!" She bolted upright in bed, heart hammering against her ribs. Had she imagined it? No, she was certain. The radio had spoken her name. The static swirled, and another voice emerged. "Why did you bring me here?" Emily reached for the dial, her fingers trembling. She turned it, trying to shut it off, but the voices only grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of cries, whispers, and groans. "Help us! Don't leave! I see you!" Panic surged through her veins. She yanked the plug from the wall, but the radio kept playing. The voices grew desperate, shrill. She grabbed the radio and hurled it to the floor. The wooden casing cracked, and for a moment, silence filled the room. Then, laughter. Soft at first, then rising into a distorted cackle that sent shivers down her spine. Emily barely slept that night. She decided to take the radio back to the estate sale the next morning. But when she arrived, the house was abandoned. Weeds had overgrown the pathway, the windows were shattered, and there was no sign that anyone had lived there for years. Confused and terrified, she returned home. The radio sat exactly where she had left it, unbroken. The crack she had made was gone, as if it had never been dropped, and the dials, they had shifted on their own. That night, she didn't turn it on, but it didn't matter. At 3:33 a.m., the radio turned itself on. This time, the voices were clearer than ever. "Emily, we need you. Come closer. We are waiting." Against her better judgment, she leaned in, her breath shallow. The static swirled, and then she saw something in the reflection of the radio's polished surface, a figure, watching her. She spun around, but her room was empty. The next morning, she searched for any information about the radio's origins. She scoured old newspapers and online forums, finally stumbling upon an article from decades ago. A man named Thomas Grayson had once owned the radio. He had been a radio host, known for his eerie late-night broadcasts. But one evening, during a live show, he had begun to scream. Listeners reported hearing strange voices interrupting his transmission. The broadcast ended abruptly, and Thomas was never seen again. His body was never found. Only his radio remained, still transmitting whispers into the void. Emily's stomach twisted with fear. She turned back to the radio, its brass dials gleaming ominously. That night she stayed awake, waiting for 3:33 a.m. When the time came, the radio switched on by itself, and this time, the voice that spoke wasn't a whisper. It was Thomas Grayson. "Emily, you need to listen." Her blood ran cold. "Why?" she whispered. "They know you have the radio now. They will come for you next." The static grew louder, almost deafening. Shadows flickered along the walls, moving in ways that defied logic. Emily backed away, but the radio's sound waves seemed to trap her in place. Then, she heard the door to her room creak open behind her. A breath, cold and heavy, brushed against her ear. The last thing Emily heard before the radio cut to silence was a voice whispering, "You should have never turned it on." The next day, Emily was gone. Her apartment was found in perfect condition, except for the radio. It sat in the middle of the floor, its dials spinning on their own. And when the police turned it on, a single voice played through the speakers. Emily's. "Help me." The door that shouldn't exist. Mark had lived in his apartment for 3 years. It wasn't anything special, just a small one-bedroom unit in an aging building. The rent was cheap, the neighbors kept to themselves, and aside from the occasional creaking pipes, the place was quiet. But one night, something changed. It started as a feeling, a strange unease that settled in his stomach as he walked down the hallway to his bedroom. Something felt off. He couldn't quite place it until he stopped in front of his bedroom door and realized what it was. There was another door, a door that hadn't been there before. It stood directly across from his bedroom, where there had always been nothing but a blank wall. The door was old, with peeling paint and a tarnished brass handle. It looked as though it had always been there, blending seamlessly with the rest of the apartment. But Mark knew better. He had lived there for years. This door had not existed before tonight. His breath hitched as he reached out, fingers hovering just above the handle. A cold sensation seeped into his skin before he even touched it, and a deep, unsettling dread settled in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone. So he did. Mark backed away and locked himself in his bedroom, his mind racing. He barely slept that night, every creak of the apartment making him flinch. When morning finally arrived, he hesitated before stepping out into the hallway, half expecting the door to be gone. It wasn't. In the daylight, it looked even more out of place. He pressed his palm against it, confirming that it was real, solid, unmovable. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had never noticed it before. Maybe the landlord had done some secret renovations. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. For the next few days, Mark ignored the door. He refused to acknowledge it, acting as if it wasn't there. But the more he ignored it, the more it seemed to demand his attention. Sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw the handle turning ever so slightly. Other times, he heard faint sounds coming from behind it, whispers, shuffling movements, the distant sound of breathing. One night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., he woke to the sound of knocking. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the apartment. 3 knocks. Silence. Then 3 more. Mark sat up in bed, heart pounding. He told himself not to answer it, told himself to stay put, to ignore it like he had been. But something compelled him to move. Against his better judgment, he got out of bed, his feet moving as if controlled by something else. He stood before the door, breath shaky. The knocking had stopped, but now he heard something else. A voice. "Mark, open the door." His blood turned to ice. The voice was wrong. It was familiar, but not quite human. Like someone imitating a person, but missing all the natural rhythms of speech. It didn't sound like it belonged in this world. He took a step back. "Who are you?" Silence. Then, a whisper right against the wood. "Let me in." Mark bolted. He ran back to his bedroom, slammed the door shut, and shoved his dresser against it for good measure. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had decided he had to get rid of the door. He called the landlord, asking about renovations, secret rooms, anything that could explain it. The response was unsettling. "Mark, there's no door in that hallway. Never has been." His stomach dropped. He hung up and grabbed his toolbox. If the landlord wouldn't acknowledge it, then he would deal with it himself. He retrieved a crowbar and marched to the hallway, determined to pry the damn thing open and see what was behind it. But when he got there, his courage faltered. The door was changing. The paint had peeled further, revealing something dark underneath, like raw, rotting wood. The handle was no longer brass, but rusted with what looked like claw marks around it. And the whispers. The whispers were louder now. "Come inside, Mark. We've been waiting. A shadow passed beneath the gap at the bottom of the door. That was it. He turned and ran. He grabbed his phone, his keys, and fled the apartment, not stopping until he was halfway across town. He checked into a motel and sat awake, waiting for daylight. The next day, he called a friend to help him move out. He didn't explain why, just that he needed to get out of there. They arrived that afternoon, but when they entered the apartment, Mark froze in place. The door was gone, not boarded up, not removed, just gone, as if it had never been there. His friend looked at him, confused. "Mark, what are you talking about? There was never a door here." Mark stared at the wall where it had been, his skin crawling. Maybe they were right. Maybe it had all been in his head. He wanted to believe that. But that night in his new apartment, as he was getting ready for bed, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A door, one that shouldn't exist, right across from his bedroom. Ethan had always been fascinated by mirrors. Something about the way they captured reality, yet distorted it ever so slightly, unsettled him. But he had never been afraid of them. Not until he moved into the old apartment on Holloway Street. The place was cheap, suspiciously so, but Ethan didn't ask too many questions. It was spacious, with vintage wooden floors, and a large antique mirror mounted on the wall of the bedroom. The landlord had insisted it was a fixture of the apartment and couldn't be removed. Ethan didn't mind. At first, it started with small things. His reflection seemed slower. When he moved, there was a slight lag. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of poor lighting or his mind playing games. But as days passed, it became undeniable. One evening, he tested it. He lifted his arm quickly and watched. His reflection hesitated just for a fraction of a second before copying him. A chill ran down his spine. He blinked hard, shook his head, and chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe it was stress from his new job. Maybe he just needed more sleep. But then, things escalated. One night, as he was brushing his teeth, he caught something out of the corner of his eye. His reflection didn't blink when he did. He froze, staring at the mirror, heart pounding. Slowly, deliberately, he closed one eye. His reflection stood still, eyes wide open. Ethan dropped the toothbrush and stumbled backward. The moment his head turned away, he heard a whisper, a breathy, almost static-like voice, echoing from the mirror. "Let me out!" A surge of cold terror gripped him. He refused to look back at the mirror and practically ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. That night, he covered the bedroom mirror with an old sheet and resolved to ignore it. But ignoring it only made things worse. The next morning, the sheet was on the floor. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the mirror. His reflection was normal. Too normal. It matched him perfectly now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, he noticed something else, a smudge on the glass. He stepped closer. It wasn't a smudge. It was a handprint. On the inside of the mirror, his breath caught. He stepped back, knocking over a lamp. The crash jolted him out of his trance, and he bolted out of the room. He spent the rest of the day out, wandering the city. Anything to avoid going back. That night, exhaustion forced him home. The mirror loomed in the dim light of his bedroom, untouched. He avoided looking at it and fell into a restless sleep. At exactly 3:33 a.m., he woke to a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the mirror. He sat up, heart hammering. The room was suffocatingly silent aside from the rhythmic tapping. With every nerve in his body screaming against it, he turned to look at the mirror. His reflection was sitting up too. But it wasn't him. The figure in the mirror had his face, his features, but its eyes were black, deep, endless voids that swallowed the light. Its lips curled into a slow, unnatural grin. Then it moved. Not as a reflection, not mirroring him. It raised a hand and placed it against the glass, fingers splaying wide, pressing into the surface as if testing its strength. "Let me out," it whispered again. But this time, the sound wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from behind him. Ethan spun around, his breath hitching. The room was empty. but the whisper had been right next to his ear. He turned back to the mirror just in time to see his reflection tilt its head, amused. Then, without warning, it raised a fist and slammed it against the glass. Crack. A thin, jagged fracture snaked across the surface. Ethan bolted. He grabbed his car keys and fled the apartment, not stopping until he was miles away. He spent the night in his car, parked outside a gas station, trying to convince himself he was losing his mind. By morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going back. He called his landlord and told him he was breaking the lease, that he didn't care about the deposit. The landlord sighed. "Let me guess," he said, voice weary. "The mirror." Ethan's blood ran cold. "You knew?" There was a long pause, then, quietly, "You should leave town." The line went dead. Ethan didn't ask questions. He drove home, packed a bag, and left everything else behind. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He found a new city, a new apartment, and tried to forget. For a while, it worked. Until one night, months later, he woke up thirsty and stumbled into the bathroom of his new place. He turned on the light and rubbed his eyes. Then, slowly, he looked up at the mirror. His reflection was smiling. The man in the peephole. Sam had always lived alone. It wasn't by choice, but after moving to the city for work, he found solace in the silence of his small apartment. It was just him and the occasional sounds of the neighbors, beyond the thin walls. That was, until he saw the man in the peephole. It started one night when he heard a soft knock at his door. It wasn't an insistent knock, just 3 slow, deliberate taps. Sam hesitated, placing his hand on the doorknob before leaning forward to peer through the peephole. At first, he thought it was empty. The hallway outside his apartment was dimly lit by flickering overhead bulbs. But then he saw it, an eye. A single bloodshot eye staring right back at him through the peephole. Sam yelped and staggered back, his heart hammering. The knock stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. Gathering his breath, he waited for something. Another knock, a voice, a shuffle of retreating footsteps. But nothing came. When he finally gathered the courage to look again, the hallway was empty. Shaken, Sam double-checked the locks before retreating to his bedroom, chalking it up to a late-night prank. But that was only the beginning. The following night at exactly 2:13 a.m., the knocking returned. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Dread pooling in his stomach, Sam crept toward the door. This time he hesitated before looking through the peephole. The eye was there again, closer. Sam felt a shudder crawl up his spine as he backed away, refusing to open the door. Again, the knocking stopped, and silence followed. Unable to sleep, he sat on his couch with every light on until dawn. The next day, he reported it to his landlord, who gave him a tired look. "This building's old," the man muttered. "Sometimes weirdos wander in. I'll check the security cameras." But that night, the knocking returned. And this time, when Sam hesitated before looking through the peephole, he nearly screamed. It wasn't just an eye anymore. A mouth, twisted into an unnatural grin, had joined it. Pale, cracked lips stretched wide, revealing rows of teeth that didn't seem to fit inside a human mouth. "Let me in," a voice whispered through the wood. Sam scrambled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He grabbed his phone and called the police, his fingers trembling. They arrived within minutes, but when he unbolted the locks and swung the door open, the hallway was empty. The officers checked the security footage. What they found made Sam's blood run cold. At 2:13 a.m., the cameras showed him approaching the door. But outside, nothing. No one had been there. The police left, advising Sam to get some rest. But rest was impossible. That night, he refused to answer the door when the knocking returned. He buried himself under his blankets, counting the slow, deliberate taps until they stopped. But the next night, it got worse. The knocking didn't come from the front door. It came from inside his apartment. Sam froze. His breath hitched as he turned toward the closet. Tap, tap, tap. His skin turned ice cold. His shaking hand reached for the closet handle, unsure if he should open it or flee. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, but some primal curiosity made him stay. Slowly, he pulled the door open. Nothing, just darkness. Just as he exhaled in relief, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I see you." Sam felt his blood freeze. His heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst. He turned, scanning the room, feeling watched. He locked every window, every door. He barely slept, but he convinced himself it was just paranoia. Maybe a hacker. Maybe his mind playing tricks. Until the next night. At exactly 2:13 a.m., he sat with his back against the door, gripping a kitchen knife. The knocking came again. This time, it was different. It was coming from all around him. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everywhere. Then the voice came back. Not from the door, not from the peephole. From behind him. "I'm already inside." A hand clamped down on his shoulder. Sam screamed. The basement that should have stayed closed. It all started when Mark and his wife Emily moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. The price was too good to pass up, and despite its eerie reputation, they convinced themselves it was just an old home in need of love. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Calloway, had passed away in her sleep, leaving the house vacant for years. As they settled in, they noticed something odd. One door in the house was sealed shut. It was an old wooden door in the back of the kitchen, bolted and locked with an iron chain. When Mark asked the real estate agent about it, she simply shrugged. "Basements in old houses tend to have problems," she said. "It's best left alone." But Mark was stubborn, and curiosity gnawed at him. Why would someone seal off a basement? That evening, while Emily was out running errands, Mark grabbed a crowbar and got to work. The chains fell away with little effort. The padlock rusted from time. He hesitated for a moment before gripping the handle and pulling the door open. A wave of stagnant, musty air hit him. The basement was dark, the stairs vanishing into the void below. He reached for his phone, turning on the flashlight. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny ghosts. Cobwebs lined the wooden beams, and the scent of mildew was overwhelming. Mark descended carefully, his footsteps echoing. The room was larger than he expected, the stone walls damp with age. Old furniture sat draped in white sheets, and forgotten crates lined the corners. But what caught his attention was a strange marking on the far wall, a symbol etched into the stone, surrounded by what appeared to be dried blood. A chill ran down his spine. The marking looked ancient, almost ritualistic. He stepped closer, brushing away the dust with his fingers, revealing deep grooves carved into the surface. The moment his skin made contact, a sharp, bone-chilling whisper filled the room. "Why did you open it?" Mark spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. The basement was empty. His mind raced. Was it the wind? A trick of his imagination? But as he turned back toward the wall, the symbol began to glow. A faint red pulse, like a dying ember. Something moved in the darkness. A shuffling sound, barely audible, sent Mark into a panic. He turned his flashlight toward the farthest corner, expecting to see a rat or an old, discarded object shifting in place. Instead, he saw fingers. Long, emaciated fingers creeping from behind an old cabinet. They curled and twitched, as if testing the air. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Then, slowly, impossibly, a figure began to emerge. Its body was contorted, thin to the point of starvation, with skin stretched taut over jagged bones. The face was wrong. Too elongated, eyes sunken into hollow sockets, and a mouth too wide, as if carved into its face. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The creature let out a guttural, clicking sound, its movements jerky and unnatural. He turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut and throwing his weight against it. His hands trembled as he locked the chains back into place, securing the padlock. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single knock. Mark backed away, his breathing ragged. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. The door rattled against its hinges, the wood groaning as something on the other side tried to force its way out. Emily returned minutes later, finding Mark pale and shaking in the living room. He refused to tell her what happened, only muttering that they should never open that door again. But the house had other plans. That night, they were awoken by the sound of something moving beneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate dragging, like nails scratching against wood. Emily sat up, wide-eyed. "Do you hear that?" Mark nodded, his throat dry. Then, the whisper came again. "Let me out." A cold dread settled over them. Mark grabbed his phone, dialing the real estate agent in desperation. When she answered, groggy and confused, he demanded answers. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. You opened the basement?" "Yes." "What the hell's going on?" Another silence. Then, in a hushed voice, she whispered, "You need to leave. Now." The call disconnected. Before Mark could react, the scratching grew louder. Then the whispers turned to laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. The basement door creaked open, chains lying broken on the floor. Something had gotten out, and it was coming for them.